Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello everybody, welcome to our Team Tuesday, the teams that self-destruct story with, this week, Ravi Jay. Hi Ravi, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Vasco. Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Ravi, on Tuesdays we talk about teams, but first we start with the book that potentially most influenced you as a Scrum Master. So tell us about that.
Vasco, the Phoenix Project, when it came out during the time I was running my startup, it helped me a lot. Firstly, because I could totally relate to the problem of long-running projects and delays in projects. And secondly, because it spoke about DevOps in a way that I could tangibly use in my startup. I read this during my formative years of agility and had a deep impact in terms of impressing on me the importance of getting things done and not be satisfied by just doing Scrum admin and facilitating Scrum ceremonies really well, Vasco.
Absolutely. If you would have to, maybe remember something specific from the Phoenix project, something that would act as kind of a recommendation for our listeners, why would a Scrum Master want to read that Phoenix project book?
I think the most important aspect is the honesty about what actually happens in large projects and programs of work. Usually, as Scrum Masters, when we go in with a tinge of optimism. We go in thinking the context is not as bad as we think it is, and this. Reading this book will really take those blindfolds off and make us see it for what it actually is. So that is what happened to me, and I'm hoping is what happens to a lot of people. It takes you from being blinded by optimism to being clear-eyed with pragmatism.
Absolutely. A great recommendation. Ravi, thank you for that. Now we turn our attention to teams and how sometimes they can become their own worst enemies. So share with us a story of a team. Tell us a little bit about their context and then walk us through that process, those steps through which a pattern or anti-pattern developed that ultimately led to problems. Tell us that story, Ravi.
It is through this work experience of story, Vasco, that I began to understand that I'm looking to build a rock star team instead of a team of rock stars. And that's the anti-pattern that I want to spend a few minutes on. This story happened about 8 years ago. And I was working with an organization with some really talented people in the digital team. The organization was good at promoting people who had good content authority on their systems. Now, as a result, it was perceived as strength for these experts to be able to talk credibly about legacy and troubleshoot system behaviors. Equally, some of the knowledge is about expected behavior per design, but perhaps not the actual behavior due to the spaghetti code and several maintenance fixes. Now, they moved to a product-based structure, and the pool of experts picked up titles of architects and landed in separate Scrum teams. So imagine, Vasco, they went from being a pool of experts to being separately deployed in separate Scrum teams. Now, the developers often viewed these architects as leaders on system landscape, and then aside, these architects had the additional role of being those developers as line manager. When we run sprint planning or refinement sessions, the leaders will often visibly participate in sizing stories and often had the most optimistic size to a story. By optimistic, I mean Vasco, obviously the smallest. The others would seek counsel and would lower their assessments to that of the architects during refinements and plannings.
That sounds like a very common estimation anti-pattern.
Exactly right. Now, this, for me, this was for two reasons. To give the perception of their technical mastery was at par with the architects. I says, again, you will see this so many times. And for that reason, they view complexity of a task in the same way and would declare that they will take the same time as a leader to complete their tasks within a story. And two, they were scoring brownie points towards the end of year performance review, and they did not want to disagree with the leader. Now, for me, Vasco, it was incredible to watch two things happen over and over again. One, the size were consistently small and incorrect. Even though the assumptions for the sizes were invalidated during development, the developers would not confront the leader about it. And as a result, the leader remained in the dark about the actual state of the system. And as a result, continued to make sizing errors. And two, the developers were working longer and longer hours, but were underreporting the hours. And as a result, they were burning out in favor of being viewed strong for end of year review process. Now, every structural guardrail I brought in to make the effort transparent, e.g., request developers to record actual steps. Now, I did something non-standard here, right? Record actual time spent on tasks on the tool. The developers would just still underreport, conduct refinement sessions without the leader. Developers would not reach a consensus. And if they did, it would be a gross undersize. Now, suffice to say, it was not working for me and for the team. The developers were on a downward spiral in terms of fatigue. Unbeknownst to all, the quality was declining. But on the surface, everyone was acting like graceful swans in the UK.
So, of course, this kind of dynamic, right, where you've got people that are hiding information from leaders, leading to bad decisions, which then influence the people who, of course, were hiding the information in the first place, and then it kind of, it spirals out of control because obviously there's too much faking and hiding going on. These things, even if we can detect them, like it is hard to detect in itself unless you are privy to what's going on and you're doing your one-on-ones and people are confiding in you what they are really thinking, which is something that us as Scrum Masters, we need to be able to build that kind of trust and our own ability to listen to what people really want to say, not just what they think they want you to say. So it takes effort, it takes experience and so on in order to even detect situations like this. But without going too much into that, I'm interested in the next step. Like when you do detect a situation like this, when you do figure out that these anti-patterns are there, Ravi, like what did you do in that story and what do you do now that you have the benefit of hindsight?
That's a really good way to pivot the conversation, Vasco. In fact, I additionally, I think it is besides detecting, I think who detects is also important, and when and why the detection was important. And I'll tell you why. In this context, we were failing, right? And for us, the context of the defects started escaping to higher environments because when people were burning out, they were getting sloppy. Now, that is when there was some attention to detail on the lines of code committed. In this case, the who, right? The engineering lead requested a metric on defect density. Now, this is a metric that is, people can frown on them. But in this case, we quite accidentally found that the number of lines of code committed to a 1-point story was as alarming to him. Now, this is where we conducted a retrospective without the leaders and the managers. When the newest developer opened up to me and each other about how they were finding their learning curve incredibly hard and how no one had time to help them. So now that now it was out in the open and out in the open publicly beyond you spoke about one-to-ones, Fasco. One-to-ones, people were telling me things, but they were not being honest to each other. Now, the mitigation action around this was respectful refinement sessions where sizing was done without the architect, and that was taken as a return to green action. Now, it took us about a good 6 sprints for us to be trusting the sizing process and for us to be working effectively and with quality baked into the process. So for me, at that point in time, it was a good 3 months later that it began to look like we had a rock star team instead of a team of rock stars. And that, Vasco, felt great because in terms of a mitigation action, all we really had to do is A, be honest with each other, and B, do refinement sessions without having the cloud or the influence of being judged, so that people can just focus on doing their day job.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that tip of what you call respectful refinement sessions. That was a great tip. Thank you for sharing that, Ravi.
Thanks, Vasco, for giving me the time.
Tuesday is Team Day here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. But tomorrow we talk about something that goes beyond the work we do with the teams. We will talk about how to lead change and what our guests have learned from leading and participating in change programs during their career. See you tomorrow. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.